I followed the rules. Ellie didn't. And now I have to live with what she's become. When Ellie found the listing, it seemed too good to be true. A weekend getaway in a picturesque cabin deep in the woods. Secluded, cozy, and affordable. We'd been arguing a lot lately. Over money, over work, over the 1,000 little things that start to add up when you've been together for a while. And this felt like our chance to hit reset. The cabin was perfect too. The pictures online showed a snug living room with a wood-burning fireplace, a kitchen straight out of a catalog, and a bedroom window that framed the most beautiful view of the forest. Ellie was already packing the moment we got the confirmation email. It wasn't until we were halfway there that she remembered to mention the rules. "Oh yeah, the owner sent this weird contract thing," she said, scrolling through her phone. "I mean, I signed it already, but it's kinda weird." She passed me her phone as she took the wheel, grinning. Like, really extra weird. I glanced at the screen. There it was, a formal list of guidelines labeled cabin rules. Number 1, do not look out the window after midnight, no matter what you hear outside. Number 2, the front door must remain locked from sunset to sunrise. Check it twice. Number 3, do not open the third drawer in the kitchen. It's not meant for you. Number 4, avoid the bathroom mirror after 2 a.m. It shows things that aren't there yet. Number 5, if you wake up to the sound of laughter, do not open your eyes. Number 6, leave the cabin by noon on the final day. No earlier, no later. Creepy, huh? Ellie said, laughing. Like, who has time to come up with this stuff? Do they think we're 5 years old? No jumping on the furniture either? I didn't laugh. There was something about the phrasing that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. Did they explain any of it? I asked. Nope, just sent it as part of the rental agreement. It's probably to scare off teenagers who come out here to party. She scrolled again. Oh wait, here's the kicker. Failure to follow these rules is not the owner's responsibility. Rent at your own risk. I didn't respond. Ellie snorted and changed the subject, humming along to the radio, but the words lingered with me. Rent at your own risk. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked just like the photos. Picturesque, clean, welcoming. The sun hung low over the treetops, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. Ellie bounded out of the car to check the place out, but I lingered for a moment, staring at the door. Someone had nailed a horseshoe above the frame. Below it, the doorknob gleamed, polished to a shine. What are you waiting for? Ellie called. Come on, let's get inside. I shook off the feeling, grabbed the bags, and followed her in. The cabin was everything Ellie had hoped for. Rustic but comfortable, with a faint smell of cedar in the air, and a cozy warmth that seemed to seep out of the wooden walls. A deer head mounted above the fireplace gave the living room a touch of kitsch, and the oversized plaid throw blankets draped over the couch felt almost too on the nose. Ellie loved it immediately. It's perfect, she declared, twirling in the middle of the room. I told you this was going to be great. No neighbors, no noise, just us. She wasn't wrong in a way. The closest cabin lay miles away, separated by thick woods and winding dirt roads. The stillness felt almost suffocating. Outside, only the occasional chirp of crickets and the faint whisper of wind through the pines broke the quiet. But even under daylight, the shadows between the trees seemed unnaturally long and deep. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I'll get the bags, I said, needing an excuse to step outside for a moment. Ellie waved me off, already poking around the kitchen. The car felt like an anchor to normalcy. I leaned against it for a second, breathing in the crisp air before grabbing the suitcases. When I went back inside, Ellie was standing in front of the kitchen counter, holding a knife in one hand and laughing. What's so funny? I asked, setting the bags down by the door. She turned to me, her smile wide. There's a drawer that won't open. It's stuck or something. What do you think is in it? I froze. The rule played in my head. Do not open the third drawer in the kitchen. Leave it, I said quickly. It's probably nothing important. Ellie rolled her eyes. Relax, Mr. Rules. I'll leave it alone. But seriously, who locks a drawer? She dropped the knife into the sink with a loud clatter and moved on, exploring the rest of the cabin. The bedroom was exactly as advertised, with a 4-poster bed facing a window that offered a view of the forest. Ellie threw herself onto the mattress with an exaggerated sigh of contentment while I busied myself unpacking. "The rules are kind of fun, don't you think?" she asked suddenly. I didn't answer right away. Fun wasn't the word I'd use. They felt like a trap, like they were designed to test us in some way. I thought about the horseshoe above the door, the way the doorknob had gleamed like it had been polished just that morning. "Not really," I said finally. "I think they're there for a reason." Ellie snorted. "You're such a buzzkill." I stayed quiet, glancing at the window. The trees outside swayed gently in the wind, their shadows crawling across the wooden floor as the sun dipped lower. I walked over and pulled the curtains closed. We spent the rest of the day settling in. Ellie always wanted to do things that maybe weren't always fully thought through. She wanted to explore the woods, but I managed to talk her out of it. It was late afternoon, and I didn't want to go trekking in unknown woods at dark. "We can do it tomorrow," I said, though I wasn't sure I meant it. Something about those woods felt wrong. I couldn't quite place it, but felt uneasy about them. Instead, we made dinner together, laughing as we fumbled around the small kitchen. The unease from earlier seemed to fade as the evening wore on. The fire crackled in the living room, casting a soft glow over the walls. Ellie stretched out on the couch with a glass of wine, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in weeks. But as the night deepened, the silence outside grew heavier. Every so often I thought I heard faint noises, a branch snapping, the crunch of leaves. But when I looked out the window, I saw nothing but darkness. The rules didn't come up again that evening. It wasn't until I locked the door for the night that I thought about the list again. Check it twice. The deadbolt was secure. My reflection stared back at me from the glass pane in the door, the faint light of the fire flickering behind me. I twisted the lock back and forth, testing it, while Ellie teased me from the couch. "Paranoid much?" Ellie said, her voice laced with amusement. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned off the living room lights, leaving the cabin in shadows. The firelight danced across Ellie's face as she looked up at me, her smile faintly curious. "You signed the agreement," I said, but my voice sounded hollow, even to me. Ellie rolled her eyes. "Come on," I said, "let's go to bed." She stretched and yawned, setting her wine glass on the table. "Fine, but tomorrow I'm opening that drawer." I didn't respond. As I followed her into the bedroom, I checked the lock on the front door one last time. The cabin settled into silence as I crawled into bed beside her, the rules still buzzing faintly in the back of my mind. Do not look out the window after midnight. I squeezed my eyes shut. I just hoped that the night would be uneventful. The night didn't stay uneventful for long. I woke up to the sound of movement. At first I thought it was Ellie shifting beside me, but when I opened my eyes, the bed was empty. The faint orange glow of the fireplace cast long shadows across the bedroom walls, flickering like they were alive. "Ellie?" I whispered, but there was no answer. I sat up, heart pounding, listening carefully. There it was again, a faint creak followed by the soft rustle of fabric. The sound was coming from the living room. For a moment I debated whether to stay put or check on her. My mind flashed to the rules. Do not look out the window after midnight. I reached out and touched the screen on my iPhone. It illuminated. 12:14 a.m. "Ellie," I said louder this time, my voice breaking the stillness. She didn't reply, but the noises stopped abruptly. I threw on my sweatshirt and stepped cautiously into the hallway, the cold wooden floor creaking under my feet. Ellie was standing by the window in the living room, her silhouette barely visible against the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. She wasn't moving. "Ellie," I said again, my throat dry. She didn't turn around. "What are you doing?" she whispered, holding up a hand. "Do you hear that?" I stopped, straining to hear. The cabin was silent, except for the faint crackle of the dying fire. "Hear what?" I asked, stepping closer. My stomach tightened as I remembered the rule. Do not look out the window after midnight. "There's something out there," she said, her voice unusually soft, almost dazed. "It's like whispering. Just listen." I froze. "Ellie, step away from the window," I said firmly. My voice shook, but I tried to keep it steady. "Don't look outside." She ignored me, her hand reaching for the curtain. "It's nothing," she said dismissively. "Probably just the wind." "Ellie, don't!" I snapped, but it was too late. She pulled the curtain back and leaned forward, her face inches from the glass. I rushed to her side, grabbing her arm and pulling her away. "What the hell are you doing?" "Nothing," she said, blinking as if coming out of a trance. "I didn't see anything, it's fine." But her tone was off, flat, almost disinterested. She shrugged me off and walked back to the couch, flopping down as if nothing had happened. "Ellie, you can't just ignore the rules," I said, my voice rising. "They're there for a reason." She rolled her eyes, picking up her wine glass from the table. "You're overreacting. What do you think's gonna happen? We're alone. No one's here to see us." But something had changed. Her mood was different, sharper. She snapped at me when I asked if she was okay, accusing me of being paranoid. Her laughter sounded forced, hollow. I finally coerced Ellie to go back to bed. I stayed awake long after Ellie had fallen asleep. Do not look out the window after midnight. There were only 6 rules, and Ellie had managed to break one of them already. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but when I woke, sunlight was streaming through the curtains. For a moment, I lay there, disoriented, my mind sifting through fragments of the night. The warmth of the morning light felt almost unnatural, too bright, too calm, and yet I was just relieved to have escaped the long shadows of the dark hours. I roll over and Ellie's not there. She's usually the late sleeper. Getting up, I head to the living room. She must have woken early and, unable to fall back asleep, decided to take a walk outside, but left the door to the cabin wide open. The chill of the morning air seeped in, and the sight of the door ajar made my stomach drop. The cold breeze prickled at my skin as I walked over to the open door, peering out into the pale morning light. The forest stood still, the trees towering like silent sentinels. I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. "Ellie?" No response. I hesitated, staring at the line where the gravel of the driveway met the tangled underbrush of the woods. She wasn't the type to just wander off. Not like this. I grabbed my coat, slipping it on as I stepped outside, the gravel crunching under my feet. The woods swallowed sound. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing but the faint whisper of the wind. I called her name again, louder this time, my voice echoing uselessly between the trees. A figure appeared, stepping out from behind a thicket. My heart jumped, but relief quickly turned to unease as Ellie approached. She was moving slowly, her face unreadable. She didn't wave or smile, just kept walking toward me with her arms at her sides. "Ellie, what the hell are you doing out here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She stopped a few feet away, tilting her head as though confused by the question. "I couldn't sleep," she said flatly. "I just needed some air." "You left the door wide open," I snapped, the tension from the night before surging back. "We're supposed to keep it locked." Ellie blinked, her expression distant. "It's just a door. Nothing happened." "It's not just a door," I said, stepping closer. "You signed the agreement. The rules are there for a reason." She shrugged, brushing past me toward the cabin. "You're getting worked up over nothing." I stood there for a moment, staring at her retreating back. The unease from the night before hadn't left me. It was growing. I turned back toward the woods, scanning the tree line one last time. For a second, I thought I saw something shift in the shadows, a flicker of movement just beyond the edge of visibility. But when I blinked, it was gone. By the time I stepped back inside, Ellie was already sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. The door, now closed and locked, seemed to loom larger than it should, the cold air still lingering in the room like a warning. "You're too tense," Ellie said without looking up. "Let it go." I didn't respond. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands shaking as I lifted it to my lips. The morning should have felt normal, mundane, but it didn't. There was something wrong, something I couldn't shake. "Oh, I found it, by the way," Ellie said suddenly as we sat in the living room later that morning. Her voice was casual, but something about her tone made me look up sharply. "Found what?" I asked. She tossed something onto the coffee table with a faint smirk. A photograph. My breath caught in my throat as I picked it up. It was a picture of us, sitting together in the cabin, except it had been taken that evening. Same clothes, same positions. The firelight in the background was identical to how it looked now. "Where did you get this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "It was in the drawer," she said with a shrug, crossing her arms. "Did you plan this with the owner or something? Very spooky." Her nervous laughter rang hollow. I stared at her, gripped with terror. "Ellie, you opened the third drawer?" "Yeah, why not?" It's just a drawer, she said dismissively, though she avoided my eyes. Come on, it's just a prank, right? But I knew it wasn't a prank. The photograph felt cold in my hands, like it had no business existing. The rules were clear. Do not open the third drawer in the kitchen. There were only 6 rules, and Ellie had already broken 3 of them. First, she looked out the window after midnight. Then, she left the door wide open this morning, breaking the rule to keep it locked from sunset to sunrise. And now, she'd opened the third drawer in the kitchen. Each time she brushed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping track, waiting for us to slip further. I made a mental list of the rules that were left, the ones she hadn't broken yet. Avoid the bathroom mirror after 2 a.m. That seemed easy enough, at least for me. Ellie, though, she'd probably stop to fix her hair if she walked by it, completely oblivious. Then there was, if you wake up to the sound of laughter, do not open your eyes. That one sent a chill through me every time I thought about it. The idea of hearing laughter in the dead of night, especially here, made my skin crawl. And finally, leave the cabin by noon on the final day, no earlier, no later. That one seemed straightforward, until I remembered how easily Ellie had dismissed the other rules. Would she even take it seriously? The day went by fast and was uneventful, at least for me. Ellie took a long nap, more than half the day, probably. Great, I thought bitterly, just what I need. That'll make it easier for her to be up at night, breaking more of the rules. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, cleaning up the kitchen, stacking firewood, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But the tension was building. Every glance toward Ellie sleeping on the couch felt heavier, like the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. That night, the tension only grew. Ellie seemed restless again, pacing the cabin as the clock crept toward midnight. I was trying to focus on reading, ignoring the oppressive silence outside, when Ellie suddenly disappeared down the hallway toward the bathroom. It wasn't until I glanced at my phone and saw the time, 2:07 a.m., that dread began to settle over me. The rule, avoid the bathroom mirror after 2 a.m. I put the book down and called out, Ellie, what are you doing? No answer. I stood, hesitating for a moment before walking toward the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. I pushed it open. Ellie was standing in front of the mirror, her hands gripping the sink. She wasn't moving. Ellie, I said softly, stepping closer. Her reflection was wrong. It wasn't mimicking her exactly. There was a faint delay in its movements, a slight distortion in the glass. It almost looked like it was watching her. What are you doing? I repeated, my voice trembling. She flinched, as if snapping out of a trance. Turning toward me, her face was pale and her eyes wide. The air in here, it's wrong, she muttered, her voice barely audible. It feels heavy. I grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind us. What did you see? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Nothing, she said quickly, avoiding my gaze. But her hands were shaking, and she didn't argue when I led her back to the living room. She sat down on the couch, staring at the floor. By now, the cabin's oppressive presence felt unbearable. The shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on us. Time itself seemed to stretch and warp. The clock's ticking sounded uneven, each second dragging longer than the last. Ellie didn't say another word, but the look on her face told me she'd seen something. Something she wasn't ready to admit. I got her back to bed eventually, though she didn't argue much. Oddly, she seemed to fall asleep almost instantly. It wasn't like her at all, and it left me lying awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, trying to make sense of what was happening in this cabin. At 3:30 a.m., I woke to faint laughter echoing through the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I remembered the rule. If you wake up to the sound of laughter, do not open your eyes. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Beside me, Ellie stirred. Do you hear that? She whispered, her voice trembling. I clenched my fists and whispered back, Ellie, don't open your eyes, just stay still. But I felt her shift beside me. It's coming from inside the room, she said, her voice tight with fear. Before I could stop her, I heard the faint rustle of the blanket as she sat up. Ellie placed her hand on my side and gently shook me. They're standing right there. I didn't dare move. Ellie, close your eyes, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. They're just standing there, staring, she said, her voice cracking. There's more than one of them. The laughter grew louder, closer, filling the room. My entire body was rigid with terror, every instinct screaming at me to keep my eyes shut. I reached out, grabbing Ellie's arm, but she didn't budge. Then, as suddenly as it started, the laughter stopped. The cabin fell into an oppressive silence, so heavy it felt like the air itself had thickened. Ellie let out a shaky breath and lay back down, trembling beside me. Neither of us said a word, but I could feel her shaking. Whatever she saw, I didn't want to know. And whatever was in that room with us, I prayed it wouldn't come back. Ellie was different when she woke up. Not dramatically so, but enough for me to notice. She spoke in whispers now, like her voice didn't want to carry beyond the walls of the cabin. Her gaze skirted mine whenever I tried to meet her eyes. But the worst part, she insisted we leave. "We need to go," she said as she paced the living room, wringing her hands. "It's not safe here. Can't you feel it?" "Ellie, stop," I said, my voice strained. "We're not leaving, not until noon." "Why does it matter?" she snapped, rounding on me. Her voice cracked as she gestured toward the window, her movements sharp and frantic. "What difference does it make if we leave now or at noon? I can't stay here anymore." I stepped forward, grabbing her shoulders. "Because that's the rule," I said firmly, trying to keep my own fear from breaking through. "If we break it, we don't know what will happen." Her eyes darted past me, to the window, to the door, to the shadows that seemed to crawl along the edges of the room. "We can't stay here," she whispered again, tears welling in her eyes. I had no choice. I couldn't let her leave, not yet. I led her to the bedroom, her protests growing louder as I pulled her inside. "It's for your own good," I said, locking the door behind her. She banged on it once, twice, but then fell silent. The oppressive quiet of the cabin returned, pressing down on me like a weight. When it was almost time to go, I unlocked the door. The room was empty, and an eerie stillness hung in the air like a held breath. "Ellie," I called, stepping inside. The bed was unmade, but her phone lay on the nightstand, and the photograph was on the floor. Except now it was different. My stomach turned as I picked it up, my hands trembling. Ellie was still in the photo, but she wasn't alone. The shadowy figures from the night before were there too, standing around her, their shapes indistinct but suffocatingly close. I stumbled back into the living room, clutching the photograph, and shut the bedroom door behind me. My chest was tight, my breath coming in short gasps. Where had she gone? The clock ticked closer to noon. I couldn't leave without her, but I also couldn't stay. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night, trying to piece together what I'd missed. The silence of the cabin felt alive, like it was watching, waiting for me to make my move. And then at 11:55 a.m., the bedroom door opened. Ellie stepped out, smiling. "Hey," she said casually, as if nothing had happened. I stared at her, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Ellie?" "What's wrong?" she asked, tilting her head. Her voice was light, but there was something off about it. Her movements seemed deliberate, like she was mimicking her usual mannerisms. Her shadow didn't line up with her body. It lagged just a fraction of a second behind, like a badly synced video. "Where were you?" I whispered, my throat dry. "Asleep," she said, her tone breezy. "You worry too much." I couldn't speak. My gaze drifted to the mirrors in the room, and in one, I saw her reflection linger a moment too long after she turned away. Her fingers tapped idly on the table, and the rhythm matched the eerie laughter we'd heard the night before. Then I saw it, the contract. It was tucked into her bag, sticking out just enough for me to recognize the heavy paper. I grabbed it, pulling it free, and my blood ran cold as I read the new edition scrawled in red ink. "Do not let her back in." My hands shook as I looked at her, sitting there like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't wrong. "Ellie," I said carefully, "we need to go." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Finally," she said, standing. I debated the rule in my head, the words screaming at me from the page. Do not let her back in. But how could I leave her? Even if this wasn't fully her anymore, it was still Ellie, the woman I loved, the one I couldn't give up on. The clock struck noon. I took her hand, and we walked out of the cabin together. But as we stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made the worst mistake of my life. We left the cabin together, but it didn't feel like we'd escaped. Ellie held my hand as we walked to the car, her fingers warm, but something about her grip felt unfamiliar. She smiled as if nothing had happened, like she hadn't been gone or locked in that room. Like the night before wasn't a nightmare. The drive home was silent. Ellie stared out the window, her expression distant. I tried to focus on the road, but my thoughts kept circling back to the contract. Do not let her back in. The words echoed in my mind like a warning bell I couldn't silence. I glanced at Ellie every so often, hoping to see something familiar, but each time I looked, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The first week back, I tried to convince myself things were normal. Ellie acted like herself, mostly. She cooked, she laughed, she talked about work, but there were moments, little cracks in the facade where she seemed off. One evening, I found her staring out the living room window, unmoving. "Ellie?" I called gently. She didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, she flinched like I'd startled her out of a dream. "Sorry," she said, her voice soft. "I was just thinking." But her eyes stayed fixed on the glass, as if she was searching for something beyond the reflection. Then there were the nights. She muttered in her sleep, fragments of phrases that made no sense, words I couldn't place, whispered in a tone that wasn't quite hers. Once I woke to hear her say, "They're waiting," and my blood turned cold. Worst of all was her shadow. It didn't always match her movements. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd see it lag behind or shift in ways that didn't align with the room's light. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that I was just tired, but I knew better. Weeks passed, and the unease only grew. Ellie seemed less and less like herself. Her laughter sounded hollow, and the way she looked at me sometimes, it was like she was studying me, not loving me. One day while cleaning, I found the contract tucked into her bag again. My breath caught as I unfolded it, half hoping it would be blank. It wasn't. The words were still there, stark and unyielding. "Do not let her back in." I stared at it for a long time, my hands trembling. The words didn't just feel like a warning anymore. I folded the paper and shoved it back where I found it, pretending it didn't exist. Because what choice did I have? I couldn't leave Ellie. Even if she wasn't entirely herself anymore, she was still here. And maybe deep down I was afraid of what would happen if I let her go. Now as I sit here watching her stare out the window again, humming softly to herself, a melody I didn't recognize, I can't help but wonder. Did I bring her back, or did something else come back in her place?